Salamat everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza, and I'd like to welcome you all to this important and timely conversation with our guest, Ronnie Barkan. Today's session is titled Zionism, Palestine, and the Road to Liberation, the true expression of collective solidarity in the face of normalization, repression, and obscuring realities. This national webinar is hosted by Palestine Justice Movement Sydney and Free Palestine Melbourne, and endorsed by other organizations across this continent, including Jews Against Occupation 48, Tzedek Collective, and Loud Jew Collective. Before I introduce our guest, Ronnie Barkan, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we are all dialing in today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. We acknowledge that we meet today on a ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 230 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I'm dialing in from Camaragal country. Again, I would like to welcome everyone who's joining us today, and I extend that welcome to those who are joining us from the dark side. In particular, for those guests, I should say that all opinions expressed by myself today represent my own personal views as a Palestinian from Gaza who happened to live on this colony and who happened to have his family enduring the past 18 months of the Zionist genocide in Gaza. And anything I say should not be construed or misconstrued as me using any authority or agency bestowed upon me as part of my workplace. Now, the state of Israel is founded upon the political nationalist ideology of Zionism. The state of Israel claims the title of the Jewish state, meaning that it is the state of all Jewish people across the world, making the suggestion that Zionism is synonymous to Judaism. But many Jewish communities around the world are rejecting these propositions. These communities are growing by the day, waking up to the reality that Zionism is not at all representative of Judaism. They are called anti-Zionist Jews, and they are staunch advocates and in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation. What does liberation mean for Palestinians and for anti-Zionist Jews? To discuss what it means to be an anti-Zionist, the efficiency of this growing movement, and to discuss the differences between solidarity and normalization, I am delighted today to be in conversation with Ronnie Barkan. Ronnie is a Jewish anti-Zionist Israeli dissident, co-founder of Boycott from Within, Anarchists Against the Wall, and a current member of Palestine Action. On Nakba Day 2022, he participated in a direct action against the UK headquarters of Israeli-based Elbit Systems. Elbit is Israel's #1 arms manufacturer and currently has boots on the ground in Gaza who help to carry out the genocide. Ronnie, welcome to the conversation. I'm really delighted to have you here, all the way from, Berlin.
Hi, Ahmed. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Ronnie. Pleasure is all mine. Ronnie, before we start, I would like to remind everyone who's listening today that today, the 17th of April, for those who are familiar with the Palestinian struggle, you know that today commemorates the Palestinian Prisoners' Day. Palestinian prisoners who are often completely forgotten in the political discourse. As Dr. Lana Tatur mentioned in my interview with her a few weeks back, more than 1 million Palestinians have gone through the Israeli incarceration system since 1967. We do not have the numbers for those since 1948. The numbers would be much, much higher. As of today, there are more than 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners being held in Israeli prisons. not including the thousands of detainees abducted and held hostage and tortured from Gaza and forcibly disappeared. 63 Palestinian detainees have been killed in Israeli custody since October 2023. Most recently, a 17-year-old Walid Ahmed, who was starved to death in March. Around 3,500 Palestinians are being held in Israeli custody under administrative detention. That's without trial or charge, including 100 children. In 2015, which is really interesting, in 2015, according to Al-Haq, Palestinian non-governmental human rights organization, between 500 and 700 minors are prosecuted in Israeli military courts each year. In the year before, 2014, 59 instances of torture were reported, a fourfold increase from 2012. In February 2015, there were 424 Palestinians held under administrative detention orders, more than double the year after, which is 181 the year before. For those who are not familiar with the term administrative detention, it allows the Israeli regime to detain people without charge or trial to unlimited renewable periods of time. It ranges between 1 to 6 months. Administrative detention can be ordered for vaguely formulated security reasons in a highly classified manner, depriving or denying detainees the possibility of mounting a paper defense. So, Ronnie, today also marks the murder of Bassem Abu Rahma, who had, a nickname of Fil, who was murdered by the ITF soldiers, and T here stands for terrorist, during a non-violent protest in the Palestinian village of Bil'in on the 17th of April 2009, the Palestinian Prisoners' Day. You mentioned that, Fil died between your arms, basically, on that day while you were part of that demonstration. Can you talk about that day and just put it in the context for us before we start?
So thank you for mentioning both of these issues, both the Palestinian Prisoners' Day and Phil, and I would like to say a few words in his memory on this specific day. So exactly 16 years ago, we were demonstrating as we would do every week on the Friday in Bil'in, near Ramallah, where the villagers have been demonstrating about the annexation of their land, the establishment of the wall and the annexation of their land. And we were going on all kinds of demonstrations, popular demonstrations, in order to demand their basic rights, being very creative also about it. And in one of those demonstrations on Palestinian Prisoners' Day 16 years ago, we went, as we would usually go, to the fence, which is a very militarized fence with all the high-tech equipment by Elbit and others. Bassem, also nicknamed as Phil, because he was a year younger than me, but he was about twice my size. We said that he had the body of an elephant, but the heart of a child. So Phil literally means elephant, so that was his nickname. And he would engage with the soldiers. Personally, I, for example, wouldn't talk to the soldiers, but he would kind of try to tell them, we are a nonviolent demonstration, we are here just about our basic rights and so on. And the very last thing that happened was that when the soldiers were already starting to shoot tear gas at us, and then he thought that they hit one of the Israelis who were present at the demo. He said, "Stop, you shot an Israeli." And as he was saying that, he was shot himself. He was shot in direct aim from a few tens of meters away with a high-velocity tear gas canister. It's basically a tear gas canister which is self-propelled, which flies like a bullet. It hit him in the chest. It opened a hole in his chest, and he was standing right next to me. It was all documented from 3 cameras, and there was little that we could do. Seeking medical help, and basically, as you mentioned, he basically breathed his last in my arms. Then he was taken to the hospital. His sister, Jawahir Abu Rahma, she died of tear gas and asphyxiation, of complications of tear gas inhalation from during one of other demonstrations a few years later. And she was taken to the hospital, and the next day she died. And his brother was actually, while he was arrested, he was shot at point blank in his foot with rubber-coated steel bullets. So this is the story of just one family in the village of Bilayin who lost some of their children and have suffered other forms of terrorizing by, as you said, the Israel terror forces, what I refer to Israel genocide forces these days. So I'd like to dedicate our discussion to the memory of Phil and to the people of Bilayin, the wonderful people of that wonderful village, which was like my second home for many years. And I miss you all greatly, and I'm sorry that I haven't visited you in a very, very long time, but my heart is still there.
I'm sure you have all your reasons to not to visit. I've heard that you've been banned from Israel because of your preachings against, you know, apartheid, genocidal state. And speaking of which, I really want to delve into the details. So, you know, Zionism, as I mentioned in the introduction, is a national ideology that the state of Israel is founded upon. You know, it benevolently, you know, calls for the establishment of a strong Jewish state for the Jewish people, because this was the only option to protect them from, you know, hate and anti-Semitism and pogroms that were rampant in Eastern Europe, that culminated in the Nazi Holocaust. So in that sense, you know, the cause of Zionism can be perceived by many as kind of rightful one. Furthermore, you know, the most logical option to establish a Jewish state is in Palestine, being of religious and sacred significance for the Jews according to the Torah and Talmud, or that's what Zionists claim. So if you criticize Zionism, if you criticize the state of Israel, you're denying the Jews of a rightful homeland, you know, the right of self-determination, you know, granted by international law and United Nations and so on and so forth. And then if you criticize that ideology, you're an anti-Semite. So what's your thoughts on that?
So basically, it is all turned on its head. The Zionist state is not a Jewish state. It has nothing to do with Judaism. It has everything to do with Zionism. This was not the only option. Actually, it was never an option for any sane or moral human being. It was also never establishing the Zionist state in Palestine on top of Palestine at the expense of its indigenous people was not the moral option. It was also never a safe haven for Jews, ever. Not before, not during, and not after the Holocaust. So any and all conflation between Judaism, which is a religion and nothing else, and Zionism, which is a supremacist, racist, nationalistic ideology, any and all conflation between the two have to be completely rejected. So obviously what the Zionists do, because their case is so weak, because basically they have established a state that is based on the exact same principles of the Ku Klux Klan, of the KKK, at a time when it was less popular, then they have wisely adopted Judaism, took over and appropriated Judaism, basically in order to justify their unjustified and illegal project. So we have to totally differentiate between the two things, and I'm happy to do so. But I will first start by saying that at the same time that Zionism came into being, first of all, Zionism was never a great success story. Less than 5% of European Jews and pretty much none of the other Jews around the world supported Zionism. Many more supported, for example, the Bund. The Bund was a socialist workers' movement across Eastern Europe. It was much more popular than Zionism. They both acknowledged that yes, anti-Semitism exists, but the result or the solution that was offered by the two groups couldn't be any different, any more farther apart. While the Zionists claimed that because of anti-Semitism that existed throughout Europe, it didn't exist in the Arab world, for example, but throughout Europe there was anti-Semitism for quite a long while. They basically concluded that because of that, the solution for them, and we can explain why, would be to establish an exclusive place for them and only for them in another place altogether, not in their places of residence. So all of those Jews who were not even religious Jews, but they were still treated badly because of their Jewish descent, their place and establish an exclusive state for them and only for them. That was their quote unquote safe space that they were building. Unfortunately, they chose another place that was already inhabited by other people in order to build their quote unquote safe space. At the same time, you had the Bund, who said, yes, of course, there's anti-Semitism, like there are many other forms of racism, and we have to fight it as we fight every other form of racism. And they saw the Zionists as racists. The Zionists who said, you, because you are Jewish, you can never be an integral part of whatever society that you live in. You cannot, if you're a Polish Jew, you can never be an integral part of the Polish society. There's a wonderful quote by Lucian Wolff, a leader of the Jewish community in London, who wrote to Rothschild, by the way, at the time. And in this letter, he said that it is bad enough when the anti-Semites come and tell us, the Jews in the UK, that we are not part of this society and we can never be part of this society. And it's even worse when it comes from the Zionists. So this is how actually most European Jews saw Zionism at the time, as some weird way to quote unquote solve that issue, which the Zionists refer to as the Jewish problem. This was their terminology. This was Herzl's terminology. Now, the Zionists also knew that they would have allies among the anti-Semites because they were totally speaking the same language. They totally fully adopted the anti-Semitic discourse, only with basically a different end goal, but they had joint interests all along with the anti-Semites. So that is one thing. The other is that, as I said, Judaism is a religion and nothing else. Some people would claim that there are other aspects to Judaism. And what the Zionists claim is that Judaism is actually not a religion. It is some sort of a nationalism, nationality, or if this is because they are racist, because they are supremacists. That's why they see it that way. People who come from a Jewish background, if they are religious, they would clearly say that Judaism is a religion. If they are not religious, but still have some relation to that background, to that heritage that they come from, they may say that Judaism is some form of cultural, it has some cultural aspect to it, and so on. I don't know what that means. If you look at Christians around the world, if you look at Muslims around the world, or Jews around the world, they speak different languages, they eat different food, they dress differently, and okay? And eventually, when the Zionist state came into being, you had this hodgepodge of all these different people coming from different places who really had nothing to do with each other other than Zionism, but they clearly did not have the same language or culture or anything like that. So saying that there is some sort of quote unquote Jewish culture is kind of silly in my view. But whatever one thinks about, this is all a matter of self identification. As far as Judaism is concerned, as far as the religion is concerned, it is a religion and nothing else. It has nothing to do with nationalism because there is no sense of nationalism in Judaism. It just doesn't exist.
Absolutely. I mean, I always
It
wondered
existed
about
long,
what
long
is,
before the age of nationalism.
yeah, I mean, what is Jewish culture? Like there's a culture of the Jewish community that lives in Yemen. There's a culture of the Jewish community that lives in Poland. There's a culture of the Jewish community that lives in Morocco. There are different cultures. There are guidelines that they all share, which is religious guidelines kind of thing, you know.
Exactly. Exactly. So, and it's more than that, even in terms of language and so on. The greatest Jewish scholar of all time, Maimonides, he was living in Egypt, uh, and he wrote the religious, the basically the interpretation of the scriptures. He wrote that in Arabic. Okay, it was it's not even about the language. Okay, there was he used he obviously spoke Hebrew for the case of reading the Bible, the
Mm,
Old Testament, but
mm.
even the interpretation of that scripture was actually done in the local language, in this case in Arabic, where he was living.
This is really interesting, Roni, because I read in a book that, you know, the Torah as a language was actually forbidden to be used in any other purposes other than just, you know, spiritual reading of the Bible or, you know, not anything else. But, you know, the state of Israel has actually revived and completely changed according to Professor Haim Farish's Zabner. He was saying that it's very different than the original Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew.
Yes, exactly. So basically, because as we said, there was all those people spoke different languages. Religious Jews spoke different languages wherever they were living. So because Jews around the world spoke different languages, they spoke different languages, ate different food, had different cultural uh, elements. It was really smart of the Zionists to quote unquote revive the Hebrew language because they needed to create something that everyone of that new Zionist state could gather around. So it was a nationalistic project to revive the Hebrew language. And it is, as Chaim Bereshit mentioned, it was not exactly like the old Hebrew of the Bible, even though still I could read the Bible because there was, unlike other languages like Arabic, which had a lot of time to evolve. Hebrew and Arabic are very similar, but Arabic is a much richer language because it had all these millennia basically to evolve. Hebrew was frozen in time. It was only used for the sake of the Old Testament.
Mm.
It was frozen in time, just like Latin is used for the New Testament, Hebrew was only used for the Old Testament. The spoken language would be of whatever place that a person is living in. And then all of a sudden, Hebrew became again a spoken language or was revived. Um, so it is a more limited language, but it was really crucial for the Zionists in order to build something that they could gather around. And then on top of that, they also came up with many myths in order to justify their shared history and justify their basically the rationale of taking over other people's land. But I have to say that Judaism has no sense of nationalism. There is no nationalism in Judaism. People don't know, but also Judaism as a religion is inclusive. Anyone may convert. It doesn't make it easy to convert. Um, it doesn't try to convert people, but anyone who wishes to do so, it would be possible for them, not recommended, but it's possible. And eventually, once someone does convert, they become a full-fledged member of what is called the Jewish people, which is a religious term, has nothing to do with nationalism, like Ummah in Islam.
Exactly. Islam is the same way. It prohibits that nationalistic sentiment because it's supposed to be, spread in contiguous kind of belief.
Yes. So Judaism is inclusive in its very nature. It's possible to convert, unlike Zionism, which is exclusive in its very nature. It is all about one and only one type of people who have the right to the land, deserve the rights, and this comes at the expense of anyone who doesn't belong to them. The one main characteristic of Zionism, if I have to describe Zionism in one sentence, it would be to say that it is a supremacist exclusive project. And the issue of exclusivity is crucial to everything that we are talking about. It is not only about the Zionists feeling that they are entitled to whatever it is also about building a place for them and only for them. Because if you remember, we said it was a reactionary response to anti-Semitism which existed at the time in Europe. And they said we have to go to another place. And how do we solve that anti-Semitic issue? We will establish a place for us and only for us. The only element is crucial. It was crucial back then and it is crucial to this day. This is why each and every Palestinian who is still in Palestine and anyone who doesn't belong to them, to the Zionists, is regarded at best as a problem which has to be dealt with. Because this is part and parcel of the Zionist type of thinking.
Which takes me to my next question, actually. Because of this religious belief, because of this conflation between Judaism and Zionism, everyone in the West is perceiving this quote unquote conflict, between the Arabs and the Jews. They all think that it's complicated, it's hard to understand. So how complicated do you think this so-called conflict, I hate the word conflict, but it's been used, very, very widely in the West, and it needs to be corrected, actually. So what do you say to those people who are saying it's complicated?
So the Zionist-Palestinian conflict is not a conflict, and there is absolutely nothing complicated about it. Actually, it couldn't be any less complicated. It is brutal, it is barbaric. By these days, it is clearly monstrous what is happening, but there is absolutely nothing complicated about it. I don't know if you came across this interview that was published the other day with Ralph Wild, who is a professor of law and a lawyer who gave a testimony at the ICJ on behalf of the Arab League when there was a discussion at the ICJ recently about the occupation and apartheid of the quote-unquote occupied Palestinian territories, or what I call the minor occupation of 67. And this was initiated by the so-called Palestinian so-called authority, which went to the ICJ in the past because they were kind of, they had no choice but to seek some jurisdiction from the ICJ. But along with the so-called Palestinian so-called authority, there were other countries who joined, including the Arab League, and their representative gave a phenomenal speech at the ICJ. Which is regarded as a masterclass. And he recently gave an interview to Al Jazeera. And the Al Jazeera interviewer actually asks him, opens by saying that he was speaking about the occupation in the occupied Palestinian territories. And immediately Ralph Wild corrects him and said the discussion was about that occupied part, which are 22% of Palestine. And then he carries on and he lays out the whole framework. But even the interviewer himself, for some reason, thought that the discussion was about the occupation. what I call the minor occupation. Actually, if you listen to that masterclass of a speech by Wilde, he starts off by laying the absolute illegitimate foundation of the Zionist race state, which is a Zionist race state. This is exactly the way I define it. It is a Zionist state, not a Jewish state, and it is all about establishing a race state for one and only one type of people based on racial ethnic characteristics at the expense of all the others. And he starts off by basically dismantling any legal basis for the very foundation of that state. Now, I am not a legal scholar, so I speak about these things from moral aspects. I speak about apartheid, also the crime of apartheid, but also what that means, and from the moral aspect, and that there is absolutely nothing legitimate about the creation of the Zionist state or anything that it has done ever since 1948. But also from the legal aspect, there is absolutely nothing legal that was done by the Zionist state since its very creation. First of all, it was founded by the UN, which had no mandate. It had no right to give away Palestinian land, because it did this in contravention of the what is called the Covenant of Nations and so on. And this is something that I go back to a lot, even the foundation of the Zionist state was done even against the very problematic Balfour Declaration and the very problematic partition plan of 1947. Because even according to the Balfour Declaration, by the well-known anti-Semite Lord Balfour, even according to that space, which was quote unquote supposed to be the quote unquote Jewish state, was supposed to house all the people of that space, regardless of ethnicity and religion and so on. The same applies to the very problematic partition plan. The partition plan of 1947 by the UN, a very unfair decision, still decided to give more than half of the land to the people who were mostly newcomers to the land. Okay, so 56% of Palestine were given to those people who were less than 1/3 of the population. Most of them were newcomers to the land, colonizers who came in to take over other people's land, and they only had about 10% of the land in their possession. And they were given more than half. Obviously, the Palestinians rejected that plan. That's a given. But also the Zionists, even though they accepted it on paper, they could never ever implement it. Why? Because that partition plan, as problematic as it was, it still decided that in this quote-unquote Jewish state, which was more than half of Palestine, that land will be shared among roughly equal populations of Jews and non-Jews. So 600,000, let's call them ethnic Jews, whatever that means. It doesn't have any meaning, but I'm just using that term because they were not religious, but they were still regarded for this or that reason Jewish, so people of Jewish descent. 600,000 of those, plus 500,000 indigenous Palestinians. So roughly the same number of people, half, were supposed to share that land. So even though the Zionists accepted it on paper, they could never ever implement the partition plan. And indeed, they never did. The partition plan was never ever implemented. So anyone referring to the partition plan as a historical basis for something, it's just an idea. It's a myth. It's yet another myth. It was never ever implemented. What was implemented was the exact opposite, which went in direct violation of which completely violated the partition plan, and the Zionists carried out a premeditated act of ethnic cleansing, which they have been contemplating for a whole year, eventually finalized that in what's called Plan Dalet, Plan D of the Haganah, 10th of March 1948. They issued it. They started the ethnic cleansing already months before that, but by the time that the Zionist state came into being, the ethnic cleansing that they have premeditated was in full force. And ever since to this day, the type of thinking is of how to get rid of as many people of the other population as possible. At the time, genocide was not as popular, especially not after the Holocaust. So they went for the second best option as far as they were concerned. The second best option was ethnic cleansing. Because how can you establish an exclusive state, which I said the foundational element of the Zionist state is exclusivity? How can you establish a state for one and only one type of people in a place that is already inhabited by others? There's only two ways that I know. You either drive them away from their land or you get rid of them altogether. It's either ethnic cleansing or genocide. And there was never a third option. So it started with ethnic cleansing. It carried on. The ethnic cleansing has been carrying on to this very day. And today we see that it has also taken the form of genocide in full force. But it could have never been carried out in any other way. So from the legal perspective, there's absolutely no legal basis whatsoever for the creation of the Zionist state. There was no reason to admit it to the UN because it violated every aspect of its mandate. And there is no reason not to kick it out tomorrow. From the legal aspect, also Israel, other than being carrying out so many crimes, including the crime of colonialism and pillage and so on, but also apartheid from its very first day of its inception, even before apartheid was defined in the Rome Statute, and later on also genocide, apartheid and genocide, both of which are crimes against humanity, which all states are obligated to fight against and to stop immediately. All of these say that there is absolutely nothing legitimate about it, and at the same time, I can explain also why there's nothing. All of these say that there's nothing moral about it. I can also explain why there's nothing legitimate about the creation of the Zionist state.
Absolutely. I mean, as Dr. Shahid Hamoudi mentioned in an interview I did last year with her, genocide and ethnic cleansing is actually the bread and butter of settler colonial regimes. And it's a typical case, a textbook case of settler colonial project that is the Zionist project, akin to what happened on this colony that I live on, in, this white supremacist ideology that, considered the land as a terra nullius, and, the people the indigenous populations of this land as non-existent. But the Palestinian case is complicated with this religious aspect. So, I mean, I spoke to, Jewish and non-Jewish figures about Zionism. I spoke about these religious aspects. We spoke about the historical aspects, the academic and the legal aspect of Zionism, and the Jewish or Israel, the state of Israel. But we never spoke. But I really want to zoom in with you about the social aspect of Zionism. I mean, you lived most of your time inside the state of Israel. You grew up there. So we always hear that the Israeli society is predominantly secular or possibly atheist even. One can argue that the large population of Jewish communities around the world as well, also secular and not really deeply religious. So, and one might ask, on what basis, do the majority of the Jewish communities inside and outside Israel build their support to Zionism and to the state of Israel, if religion is not a dominant factor? How are they still, as Naomi Klein said, idealizing this, calf of the state of Israel?
Anyone who respects Jewish religion and anyone who practices that religion would be necessarily anti-Zionist. Zionism is actually an affront on Judaism. So you see that with the ultra-Orthodox Jews, who were staunchly anti-Zionist to begin with. Zionism was only came into being among quote-unquote secular Jews in Europe. The religious Jews of Europe, they were not part of the Zionist project at the time. And the Zionists who founded Zionism and the Zionist state, they hated, they loathed the ultra-Orthodox, the religious Jews of Europe. The whole point was that they didn't want to be like them. They were saying the most racist things against those religious Jews. Later on, after the Holocaust, things have changed, and some people have kind of decided to accept Zionism to a certain degree. But to this day, you have many religious Jews who are staunchly anti-Zionist. Because of their Judaism, they are anti-Zionist. Now, I mentioned before that you have different characteristics of Judaism versus Zionism. I don't see how one can even be Jewish and Zionist at the same time, because the two things are not even logically, it's not coherent to be both. They have not only different values, completely different values, but also the very characteristics, the very nature of Judaism and Zionism are so different. And I'll give you one other example. I mentioned that Judaism is inclusive in its nature, while Zionism is fundamentally and forever exclusive. Another issue is the role of the state. In Judaism, if the state has any role, it is in order to serve the religious practice. In Zionism, if religion has any role, it is in order to serve the state. So the religious institution inside the Zionist state has been totally co-opted by the state, and the religious institution has become totally subjugated to that state, and willingly so. So there are many people of religious background, or people who are religious Jews, who demand the separation of state and religion inside the state, the Zionist state, for their own religious sake, because of how the state keeps hold of the religion and basically brings Jewish religion to this base form of racism and nationalism. So there is a great difference even in the religious institutions if you look at those inside the Zionist state and anywhere else around the world. The other thing is that, what does it mean to be Jewish? Obviously, if you're a religious person, your religious practice, that is what defines your Jewishness. As you mentioned, most Israelis do not define themselves as being religious. Their religion is Zionism. Their religion is nationalism and ultranationalism, which they call being Jewish. So Zionism has basically successfully converted people from Judaism into Zionism. You can look at it in a way as a competing form of religion, competing religion to Judaism. The best way to look at Zionism is simply to look at it as a cult, because the whole type of thinking behind Zionism is that of a cult, and everything is based on us versus them. And if you're from the others, you are necessarily regarded as the enemy. But yes, I mean, there is this rift between the two things. So I think that any type of trying to legitimize the Zionist state by this or that religious aspect or Jewish aspect should be totally and utterly rejected. The two things have nothing to do with each other. If anything, for the sake of Judaism, we have to oppose Zionism. And there are many Jews, people of Jewish descent or religious Jews, who vehemently oppose Zionism. And there are many people who are not of Jewish descent who are very much advocating for Zionism.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the Zionist ideology has kind of brainwashed the Jewish community around the world to believe in this nationalistic supremacist ideology that you mentioned. And there's a lot of Jewish communities and Jewish individuals are rebelling against this. And that leads me to my next question. There's this growing movement of anti-Zionist Jews around the world. I mean, has the Jewish anti-Zionist movement across the world, been effective in the global Palestine solidarity? And on top of that, I really want to ask this question, like, when we say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, for Palestinians, what we do know what that means for us. What does that mean for anti-Zionist Jews as well? Like, I know there are two questions, like, has the movement been effective so far? And what does it mean for an anti-Zionist Jew free Palestine from the river to the sea?
You know that when I give a talk many times, there's like they invite a Palestinian speaker as well, and people expect that we will represent two different sides of the story. And then I have to say, look, we don't represent two different sides. We represent the exact same side, only that we have different status. I come from the side, I represent those who are among the privileged group. My fellow speaker represents those from the underprivileged group, but we have the exact same narrative. Because, and you asked me about, I'll start with that, you asked me about how complicated it is, and I said, there's nothing complicated about the Zionist project in Palestine. It is very clear. And the way to explain it, it is that, you see, if you look at any other place where there is a system of domination and oppression and terror, whether it is slavery in the US, apartheid in South Africa, Nazism, fascism, and so on, you have two quote unquote narratives. You have the slaves and the slave owners. You have the Nazis and the people under the Nazis, the apartheid people and the people under the boot of apartheid in South Africa. It's very clear. It's very uncomplicated. Okay, you have different interests for each group, but morally speaking and legally speaking, there's absolutely nothing complicated about it. What makes it supposedly more complicated about the Zionist case is that there is another quote unquote third narrative that cropped up, which is 100% propaganda, which is called liberal Zionism. Pretty much every article that was ever printed on Haaretz newspaper is an example of that. Haaretz newspaper is the leading form, the most effective tool of Zionist propaganda. Why so? Because this quote unquote liberal Zionist narrative, so there are only two clear narratives. The one of the oppressor group, the ones who want to take over and to subjugate and to usurp, and the ones who are the people of the land who have been subjugated and oppressed, and so on. These are the very clear narratives. In the middle, there is a third type of narrative that came up in the case of Zionism, which tries to give another version of reality altogether. And that other version of reality tries to say that there is something legitimate about the creation of that Zionist race state, that it was not built on the basis of apartheid and ethnic cleansing and colonialism and all the rest at the expense of the indigenous people, but only later things went bad. And usually they point the finger at 67. Oh, the occupation of 67. Oh, the settlements of 67. When people say I'm against the occupation, I ask, which occupation? 48 or 67? When they say I'm against the settlements, which settlements? 48 or 67? Okay, when during the Gaza ghetto uprising of 7th of October, when Palestinians went to those kibbutzim, they said, we are the mustautanat, we are the settlements. They were just across the fence from Gaza. The majority of the people in Gaza are refugees from just across the fence. 70%, 80% of all Palestinians in Gaza are refugees from just across the fence. So they literally went to their land. These are the settlements, the real settlements, the settlements of 48, not those of 67. So the other narrative tries to say that there is a legitimate basis for the creation of the state of Israel, and only some aspects, some policies need to be changed. And usually they would point the finger at the right wing, at Netanyahu, at the settlements, at what is called the occupation of 67, and so on. Whereas actually, it is not about the policies of the state, it is about the very nature of that state that is, as I put it before, the very same nature as that of the KKK. It is all about white supremacy, or if you want, racial ethnic supremacy of one select ethnic group at the expense of all the others. This is the only way to look at the Zionist project in Palestine. So, having said all of that, and understanding that it is not complicated, I have also even challenged a few of the special rapporteurs, for example, the UN about and other people about apartheid. Now, as I said, I'm not a legal scholar, but when we talk about apartheid, people think that apartheid exists in Hebron, in the West Bank, and so on. But actually, the most part of apartheid is that which exists inside what is called Israel proper, what we call Palestine 48. Palestine, which was occupied in 1948, rather than the rest of Palestine, which was later occupied in 67. The main group that is suffering today from Israeli apartheid are more than half of all Palestinians who cannot even go back to Palestine. Half of all Palestinians are in forced exile for the past more than 7 decades, for one and only one reason, because they were born into the wrong ethnicity. These are the main victims of Israeli apartheid. Under the law of the crime of apartheid, these are the main victims. So I've even challenged those legal scholars who try to speak about apartheid but only point the finger at what Israel does in the West Bank and Gaza and so on. And this is actually missing the point. This is unfortunately simply not good enough. We have to understand the entire picture, and the entire picture deals with the very way that Zionist state was founded on top of Palestine and at the expense of its indigenous people. So finally, I can answer your question. What do I mean by free Palestine from the river to the sea? We mean exactly that. Free Palestine from Zionism. Free Palestine from that racial supremacist or racial domination of one group over the other. And finally, once we abolish Zionism, and that is the only way to go about it, then we can have a place that respects the rights of all 21 million sons and daughters of the land. And by saying that, I allowed myself, with your permission, to include the 14 million Palestinians along with the 7 million what are regarded as Israeli Jews, who will have to renounce their privilege and become, hopefully in the future, people of the land.
Which is, I would say, would be a massive challenge on their behalf, because it's a decades-long indoctrination process into turning those individuals into what we see in Gaza right now. I mean, abolishing Zionism, absolutely, it's the way forward. Abolishing this supremacist view of others, of othering. You know, I would go on a limb and say it's akin to the Nazi ideology, that the way they looked at the Jewish populations in Germany and in Europe in general. It's that supremacist. So they do share a lot of aspects and even tactics of engagement with their victims. I'm glad that you mentioned the liberal Zionists in there, because this is my last question. I left the best question to the last. But before I ask this question, I really encourage everyone to put their questions in the Q&A, because we're going to get to them very soon. So there's a question that I put on the leaflet, which is incredibly important. You know, the difference between solidarity with the Palestinian cause and normalization. Where do we draw the line between the two concepts? I mean, we have some instances where things get blurry, like liberal Zionism you mentioned, Haaretz, but that's more in your face, right? For the people who are knowledgeable about the cause. But then we have, those new groups that are emerging, standing together or friends of standing together, that's a fairly new organization that is starting to establish itself here in Sydney as well. It's got a lot of branches worldwide. And even, there's also this podcast that's called itself Third Narrative, just building on what you just said, that a third narrative. And lastly, the last example that is kind of controversial, which is No Other Land. It won the Oscar, but it's been put on the boycott list for, the academic and cultural boycott list. So could you elaborate what normalization means, in relation to solidarity?
So first of all, the concept of normalization is possibly the least understood concept when we talk about BDS and when we talk about the struggle in Palestine. According to the BDS movement, and PACB, the Palestinian Academic Cultural Boycott, they have a clear definition of what they mean by normalization. Normalization in the Arab world, tatbiya, is something a little different. It's about no communication, no interaction with Israel, period, which is actually what is needed right now. But in the BDS context, when we talk about normalization, it simply means that any interaction between Israelis and Palestinians, so people of the oppressor group and the oppressed group, any interaction between you and me needs to be done in order for it not to be an act of normalization. There are two conditions. One is that I will respect your rights as enshrined under international law and so on. Okay, the basic rights that are mentioned in the BDS movement and so on. I just have to respect that you have rights under international law. The second thing that is demanded of me is that, or of our interaction, is that we do not normalize what is abnormal. We do not legitimize what is fundamentally and inherently illegitimate. So we do not carry on the status quo. We say we don't accept the status quo. If I accept the rights and we do not carry on the status quo, we don't accept the status quo, then we can have homes for peace and football for peace and all of that. Okay? But first of all, there needs to be this understanding. Now, it sounds simple, right? But so few interactions between Israelis and Palestinians actually live up to that. And this is for a good reason, because all these interactions are about actually creating a facade of normality and legitimizing what is fundamentally illegitimate. Because they don't want to talk about politics, they want to do something away from politics. They don't want, they say it's complicated, there are two sides, remember the two narratives and so on. Yes, of course there are the two narratives. There are the oppressor and the oppressed. These are the two narratives. Okay? But we have to accept that the oppressed have their rights. And they have every right to demand their rights. So, having said all of that, you mentioned, let's start from the easy to the difficult, from the, let's call it light-minded or whatever, to evil, to the monsters. So the easy one is No Other Land. I watched that film. Personally, I couldn't wait for it to be over. I was suffering throughout. Now, the problem with that film is that, and I watched it before it won the Oscars, by the way. The problem with that film is that it has so much potential. And I believe that it was done by very well-meaning people. But, so it has beautiful cinematography, and you have wonderful protagonists, and the scenery is beautiful, and there's so much potential there. And there's the action with the military, and everything you could want from a film, other than one thing. There's no story. There's absolutely no story there. There's absolutely no political statement or political analysis at all. And whenever there is a chance to have a political statement, it immediately tries to circumvent that. So I remember, I think it was quite early in the film where Yuval Avraham, one of the protagonists, he this older Palestinian who tells him the Zionists, or he asks Yuval, can you forget the place where you were born? And he says no. And then he says the Zionists want us to forget where we were born. And just from that, this could expand into so many different directions, go into so many different directions, and of course, dealing with 48 and the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing, and so on. There are clear examples wherein they mention that there are two different colors to the Hawiyah, to the identity card, the green and the blue, for the underprivileged and for the privileged group. But there's nothing is being said about that. Even just the basic stuff was never really explained properly. So one would think that it is some sort of a conflict or some sort of a oppression of the military and whoever is in charge of that military over those villagers. There is no context to that. Having said that, you see the oppression. Your heart is with the Palestinian people there, of course, who are wonderful people, and it seems like also the filmmakers mean well, but there is no message there. So for that reason and for reasons of funding, I know that the actually FACB issued a statement that it does fall into the definition of normalization, but I don't think that people are doing much about that. But I'm just saying, I had serious issues with that film because it could have been so much more than it actually is. And I know that the people who made the film, they themselves are not that political in their very nature. I see what they write. They write, by the way, on a liberal Zionist outlet called 972 magazine. Okay? Which is part of the problem, which aspires to be a Haaretz 2.0, the alternative to Haaretz, which is bad enough. I mean, they write some of the horrible things in 972 magazine. Some of their writings are also okay. But these people, they write things that are not challenging enough the political situation. Okay, so that's about No Other Land. I was frustrated with it, but I can also see the value of such a film.
So it didn't really provide that, historical depth to the Palestinian dilemma. And also, I recall the exception speech of Yuval was a little bit off. And
Yes.
he also focused on, superficial things, really important, ending the genocide and so on and so forth. But he never mentioned, the colonization of the land of Palestine and so on and so forth.
And there is always the false parity, both in the film, but especially in that speech, for example, which people, especially Palestinians, really, really rejected because there was this false parity by mentioning Musafir Yatta and then immediately mentioning the hostages, the 200 or so, or now it's 59 or so hostages in Gaza. I know that, as far as I know, there are 2.3 million hostages in Gaza, including plus the 10,000 who are languishing in Israeli dungeons, the ones that you mentioned. This is Palestinian Prisoner Day today. The holding of prisoners, as you excellently mentioned earlier, this is part of state policy. Okay, the using of incarceration without even due process. I mean, the majority of the prisoners, even today, 10,000, more than 10,000 actually are in prison, and 1/3 are administrative detainees without trial, without charges. But on top of that, you have illegal combatants, for example, which is a legal term that was created by Israel in order to, again, to arrest people without having to prove anything. You have people who are held also just as a matter of the fact that this is an apartheid state, and if they want to be able to supply for their family, they have to work inside 48. And in order to do so, they may be doing so without the right permit and end up in prison and so on. So you have a majority of the people are in prison basically because this is how the system operates, because this is by design.
Absolutely. It's by nature, it's a carceral state.
Yes.
And that's the definition of all colonies, you know, especially on this colony here as well. You know, the incarceration of First Nations people, you know, children, and so on and so forth. But I'm really keen to talk about the other more evil narratives, or, you know, so to speak, third narrative, and, you know, the standing together, because it's really important to understand their, you know, logic.
Yes. So standing together got quite a lot of attention over the past year and a half during the genocide. They've been very active on social media and so on. I know that nowadays they are trying to take over all kinds of places around the world, basically places where you have like pro-Palestinian activism, and they are trying to kind of take over. You have these groups propping up, friends of standing together in different places. Let's say a few words about this organization. Um, First of all, I have to mention that the BDS movement has already rejected them as a normalization group. Okay, that no pro-Palestinian group should basically lend them legitimacy and cooperate with them. And you have a statement on the BDS movement website. Other than that, this group is, for one thing, its politics is catastrophic. It is all about false parity. It is all about kind of this balancing the Israelis and Palestinians, never saying anything that is critical of the apartheid system, critical of everything that we're discussing up until now. The only word that they allow themselves to use is the word occupation. And obviously, when they say occupation, they mean the occupation of 67, never the occupation of 48. I know, for example, even from people who were Palestinians who were participating in standing together and later on decided not to be part of that any longer, and even on my like Medium blog, actually I have this testimony of a Palestinian who was part of standing together, and he, in his own words, he explains why he is no longer part of that. He talks about how when there was a demonstration, they were talking, the people of standing together, the leadership, they were talking about how when they were in New York, they were approaching pro-Palestinian protesters who were chanting Free Palestine, and they were approaching them, basically rejecting, telling them that this is a problematic chant, Free Palestine, because there are two sides. But what about the Israelis? So yes, Free Palestine, but what about the Israelis? You understand? This is kind of the narrative, always trying to equate the two. They are funded by the New Israel Fund, which is a rabid, supremacist, liberal Zionist organization that rejects that basically that anything was wrong before 1967. Yes, of course they are against the occupation of 67, but they say no, Israel was, everything about it was fine, and they are very much opposed to the BDS campaign and so on. Standing together is also cooperating with people who are proper Hasbara agents. Actually, two Palestinians. The names are Amira Muhammad and Ibrahim. I will remember the name in a moment. They are actually working for a liberal Zionist organization, They have a podcast called The Third Narrative. This is the name of their podcast. And they totally regurgitate Zionist propaganda, full-on hasbara. Okay, as Palestinians, they work for a liberal Zionist organization, and everything they say is basically textbook hasbara messaging. And standing together is inviting these people on their behalf to speak around the world and so on. And I can give you some examples of these folks. Another thing we should know, standing together is also basically, in a way, a recruitment agency for Hadash Party. Hadash Party Jabha in the apartheid parliament led by Ayman Odeh. I am absolutely against that party. Personally, I refuse to vote to any party in the apartheid parliament. I vehemently refuse to vote to that parliament, but I am especially against that Jabha party, Hadash party, which is, I would say, a liberal Zionist party, only Arabic-speaking liberal Zionist party. What do I mean by that? When that party was part of the joint list, until not too long ago, the joint list, the platform, had some vague mention of the right of return of Palestinians, of the refugees. Since they split, because they basically, that party decided to split from the joint list, to dismantle the joint list, they have even removed any mention of the right of return and the rights of refugees from their party platform. And they also reject BDS, and they speak this language of this false narrative of two-state discourse and so on. So, and I can show you the connection between the people of Standing Together and the people of Hadash Party, which is almost one-to-one. Okay, so for all of these reasons and more, there are reasons to reject Standing Together. I can give you later the link to this blog post, which kind of details where they stand and what they say.
That would be fantastic. I will share it with everyone who's listening today as well. It's important to understand these things. But I mean, lastly, I mean, something you said, Ronni, that really excited this question in my brain. We're hearing a lot of governments and political officials saying, regurgitating this, we support two-state solution, the right sovereignty for Palestinians and so on and so forth. Is it right to say, it is liberal Zionist to have these two elements to your speech, supporting the two-state solution and rejecting resistance, the Palestinian resistance? Like, if you're not supporting the Palestinian resistance, if you keep regurgitating this two-state perfunctory statement, this is liberal Zionism.
Yes, absolutely. First of all, even under the law, under international law, oppressed people have the right to resist their oppressors. So it's a no-brainer. It doesn't matter what we think about it, they have the right to do so. Definitely the people in Gaza have every right to resist. Just as the people of the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto uprising had every right, even if they would have carried out things that are regarded as criminal behavior, war crimes against the people of Warsaw City. In that situation, there's only so much that you can do. The people inside the the Gaza ghetto, which was established as a refugee camp, maintained as a concentration camp for decades, and now that concentration camp has been transformed into an extermination camp. If they reject all of that and try to oppose all of that, they have the right to do so. They don't have the right to kill innocent people, but they definitely have the right to resist. The two-state discourse is extremely problematic Because what is meant by the two-state discourse is, first of all, why do Zionists support two states? Because among Zionists, basically you have the two types of Zionists: the ones who are racist and proud of it, and they will dictate to the Palestinians everything. They are the masters of the land, and they will decide about the fate of the Palestinians. And some of them want to drive away all Palestinians from the land, as they are trying to do these very days. And some of them want just to keep them caged in smaller and smaller territory. And then you have the so-called liberal Zionists. The liberal Zionists, they speak a different language, a much more sinister language in a way, because they cover everything they sugarcoat everything, and they cover it in the language of peace and human rights. And those people who consider themselves liberal Zionists, they want to feel that they are the Democrats, the liberals in this story, that they are the good people in this story. For that reason, they need to have two states. Not because they care about Palestinians. They cannot even see Palestinians, but they need to have two states in order to have their cherished Jewish majority in that territory that they will call the Zionist state. So they are willing to give up some territory in order to have as many Palestinians on the other side of the border, and as few Palestinians along with them sharing that space. This is the whole notion of the two-state solution, which is no solution at all. It is all based on the issue of demographics, making sure that as many Palestinians are over there and as few of them are here with us. And then if we have less Palestinians with us, we can claim that we are democratic. As a matter of fact, Israel was never a democracy. It was built as an apartheid state from the get-go. But already from 48, the Zionists were only 1/3 of the population, as we mentioned, about 600,000 people, and then double that were the Palestinians. Today, the Zionists are still only 1/3 of the population, only that they managed to keep half of all Palestinians in forced exile. They managed to put others in a concentration camp or in different Bantustans, or as citizens who are stripped of their basic rights, so they are second-class citizens at best. And then when they do all of that, then they can claim that they are a democracy, and they can claim that they are the majority, because they have built a whole system of apartheid, a very sophisticated form of apartheid, that makes sure that all these other groups are stripped away of their basic rights. And this idea of a two-state is just yet another aspect of that system of apartheid, which strips away people's rights and makes sure that they cannot participate in our cherished democracy.
And Zionism will continue to maintain its privileges and supremacist ideologies and so on and so forth. Thank you very much for that insight. Really, it's very revealing. I want to go to the questions, and the first question, there's a number of questions there, and I'm just going to mold them and bulk them together. We've marched in the streets. We've, spoken out. We made speeches. We boycotted products that support the Zionist state. We did everything we can for the past year and a half. What else can we do? You being part of, this group that you initiated inside the State of Israel, Boycott from Within, and part of the BDS. What else can we do to progress or advance this movement and make tangible impact to end that, to win that struggle?
I think that in the past, we could have focused more on, let's call it advocacy, or applying pressure from the outside by means of trying to convince the world, etc., like in terms of BDS. When I was in Palestine, I was focusing on taking part in solidarity actions in the West Bank. I was part of Anarchists Against the Wall, which is kind of a direct action group of conscientious Israelis who were invited by Palestinians to demonstrate. When I was outside, I was focusing mostly on BDS. How do we apply pressure from the outside in order to change the situation inside? Now I think that we are at a whole other level of urgency and what is needed in order to change the situation. Basically, the time for civil disobedience is over. Now is at least time for direct action. Now is the time to disrupt the war machine, disrupt every aspect of this machine of oppression, domination, and terror. And unfortunately, all of our governments are complicit in that. Actually, every single government other than one of the poorest countries in the world, Yemen, they are the only ones who actually stand up for Palestinian rights these days. All the others may have done some actions in the right direction, like South Africa, like Ireland, which kicked out the Israeli ambassador, but far from doing enough, because there is both a legal and a moral obligation to stop this genocide. Not only to stop this genocide, we're talking about a long, long list of crimes, and at least genocide and apartheid are regarded as crimes against humanity, which must be abolished. Legally speaking, even, any recognition of the Zionist state, any diplomatic ties with Israel is not lawful these days by any country, including Australia. Now, since our governments are not doing what they're obligated to do, our elected officials are not doing what they're obligated to do, it is up to us, the people. And I see our role today, and especially myself right now in Germany, in a situation which is very, very similar to Germany 90 years ago. And what would I have done as a German dissident who is opposed to Nazism, fascism 90 years ago? And the very same applies today to Israel and all of its accomplices, including Germany, by the way, which is committing yet another genocide. So when we look at the writings of the White Rose resistance movement here in Munich, they did not only talk about the rights of the minorities, they also talked about, in their leaflet number 3, they wrote about sabotage. Sabotage of the arms factories, sabotage of the war machine, sabotage of every gathering of the Nationalist Socialist Party, and so on. And at the very least, each one of us has to think, how can they sabotage the system? And sabotage can be done in what is regarded as a legal way, basically being, something in the way of the system. You can hold sit-ins, you can at the very least hold demonstrations, you can do many things. You can go to the city council everywhere around the world. Go to the city council and demand that they speak up about Palestine. Worst case, you'll be asked to leave, and then the next person in line will come in and demand that. That is the bare minimum. At the same time, other people are taking direct action. I am part of Palestine Action. I took part in smashing up the Elbit Systems headquarters in Bristol, UK. Elbit Systems is Israel's #1 arms manufacturer, which produces pretty much every murder machine that is being used right now in Gaza. And actually, Elbit is currently in Gaza perfecting its murder machines alongside with the Israeli soldiers. So they are actively participating in genocide. And people in the UK and now across the world, also in Australia, there's Palestine Action Australia. Please look it up and join their activity. People are going to the source and taking action in order to stop this monstrosity, this barbarism. Now, because our governments are fully complicit, it is up to us. And those people who take direct action, yes, they are putting their liberty on the line. And not everyone can afford to do that, but some people are doing so. And we should respect that and encourage that. And I am very, very happy to see and encouraged by the level of engagement, how more and more and more people want to join, even though the governments are cracking down on activists and legislating new laws to put us in prison and to arrest us under all kinds of, for example, all kinds of bogus charges, and they legislate these new anti-terrorism laws and so on, specifically in order to be able to put us in prison until trial and under all kinds of harsh conditions. And still, there is more and more engagement of new activists who basically are waiting in line in order to take action, in order to stop this monstrosity. And this is really encouraging. We are seeing, you asked about Jewish groups around the world, we are seeing the engagement of different Jewish groups, whatever that means, people of Jewish descent around the world, who stand up to say, this is not being done in our name. And Jewish Voice for Peace, for example, in the US, has grown tremendously over the past decade. They are the largest growing, basically, Jewish group in the US, growing far bigger and faster than AIPAC and J Street and all the other Zionist groups. You also have, and there is this sense of, the more extreme that the situation is, the more that people are forced into basically make up their mind. We can no longer stay on the on the sideline. Okay, and we have to decide whether I'm on the side of the oppressor or the oppressed. And this also forces those people who come from Zionist homes, who grew up with some Zionist upbringing, to question their Zionism altogether. And these are all of these things are happening, and this is very encouraging.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I mean, those individuals who are forced to do direct action or civil disobedience, they're actually fulfilling their, if not legal, according to the ICJ, it's got to be countries who are fulfilling, which you mentioned Yemen. Yemen is actually fulfilling its obligations under the ICJ ruling and international law to prevent or to punish genocide by their actions. And for us as individuals, it's more of a moral obligation to what's happening. There's that question here about Zionism. Do you think that Israel has now lost their credibility and consequently support of other nations because of Gaza? And is this the best moment or opportunity now we have to end Zionism, as it were?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that this is exactly the case. Because the situation is so extreme, it is so dire, because Zionism has gone to this extreme level of monstrosity and even unashamed of its monstrosity, things have changed. Things will never be the same again. So for the past 7 decades, we have been fed with this liberal Zionist propaganda as if there is something legitimate about Zionism. Since the 7th of October, we are in a whole other phase. It comes at a very, very high price, but there is no going back. People will never be able to look at Israel and see something that is legitimate and normal and not basically supremacist and barbaric. And by that change of perception, we finally have a chance to, first of all, to speak about the real issues. The real issues are that the whole creation of the Zionist state is an issue. It is not this or that policy of the state. I don't care about this or that policy of the Zionist race state. I care about the very nature of that state, which is fundamentally wrong and illegitimate. The very character, supremacist character of that state has to be abolished. Only then we will have a chance to have a better future for all the people of that land. And it is very clear when you talk about other cases, like slavery, for example. Tweaking slavery means very little for the slaves, and it definitely means very little in terms of abolishing slavery, of freedom and equality, right? Why is it different with Zionism? You see, when I say that, if I will say that I support the resistance, for example, I will only be regarded as a traitor in Israel. But if I say that I support full equality for all the sons and daughters of the land, this is outside of the scope of the thinking of any Zionist. It's simply beyond their ability to imagine, to understand what I actually mean by full equality. Because Zionists, because they are Zionists, they are incapable of seeing Palestinians. They're incapable of seeing anything other than their limited framework.
Which goes to my next question, Ronnie. Sorry to interrupt. Like, are you actually, is there a hope that there will be some sort of anti-Zionist movement growing, or is there an anti-Zionist movement growing inside of Israel?
So, inside of Israel, I think there is less of an anti-Zionist movement. There are people who are forced kind of against the wall because of the situation to reevaluate where they stand. It is very difficult to come out of Zionism because of this cult-like mentality. Because coming out of a cult, coming out of this very intense form of brainwashing and indoctrination is apparently not that easy for most people. But they are still forced into reevaluating where they stand. This is for most Israelis. At the same time, there is clearly an anti-Zionist movement of Israelis and of, as I said, people of Jewish descent around the world, and obviously the people of the world. We are the majority. We are the millions and the billions. We have to remember that. It's not our politicians that are deciding. It is us who have the power. When we say in our millions, in our billions, we're all Palestinians, this is literally the case. We are the majority. You know, we had 1 million people out on the streets in London. And it was very clear. And then, I mean, the energy was wonderful. And then all of a sudden there was the chanting of ceasefire now, you know, and I kept silent. Because ceasefire now, even though it has a nice ring to it, what does it actually mean? It is a very, very weak demand. So we have to better to focus our demand, to focus our energies, because ceasefire means very little, and we saw what ceasefire actually meant only recently, right? Our demand should be much, much bigger than a ceasefire, much bigger than just about tweaking the situation. We have to abolish that system of oppression, domination, and terror. And when we talk about the Jewish anti-Zionist movement, I have to invite all of you. I know that the folks in Australia are a little farther away, but if you can, please join us in a couple of months. We are organizing the first Jewish anti-Zionist Congress. It will be in Vienna on the 13th of June, on the weekend from the 13th to the 15th of June. And all of us, it doesn't matter how each one the self-identification of each one of us, all of us who the Zionist state claims to speak on our behalf will gather together along with our Palestinian partners and all our international allies to have a clear and unwavering rejection of Zionism and rejection of the Zionist race state. Basically, a clear anti-Zionist front and a clear, basically, declaration of war on the Zionist state. And this will happen on the 13th of June in Vienna. Everyone is invited, and soon there will be also publications on that. We are currently working on that Congress as we speak. 128 years ago was the first Zionist Congress, and now it is about time to have what will be the first Jewish anti-Zionist Congress, the first but definitely not the last. We need to have more and more of these gatherings where we will not only discuss the history, we will discuss the practical measures in order to abolish Zionism and hopefully also discuss the day after. What happens after Zionism? All of these things will be discussed by all of us, people of Jewish descent and Palestinian partners and everyone else. All are welcome to join.
This is groundbreaking. This is incredible. It's an exciting opportunity, and thanks for the invitation. Does the invitation come with flight tickets though, or?
Unfortunately not. I'm sorry.
No, it's a great initiative. It's about time, like you mentioned, to mobilize and all the collectives to come together to form one front against this Zionist supremacist ideology that speaks on their behalf. And I've got one last question, Ronni. Being an insider, having lived and grew up in Israel, you definitely have some friends and family still there. The question says, what is the economic and daily lived experience inside Israel at the moment? Is there a real tangible feeling of decay, or is this a real galvanizing moment for the population? Galvanizing as in, because I always think of the current war, the Zionist mentality, this is a war of liberation, expanding the remit of their control. So what's the economic situation and what's the feel inside the society?
So I haven't been in Palestine since just a little before 7 October. So last time I was there was almost 2 years ago. And I'm not sure how safe it is for me to go these days. But what I hear from friends is that since the 7th of October, things have gotten even far, far worse. I used to say all the time that I am an anti-fascist from a clearly fascist state, and I can say these days that I am an anti-Nazi from a clearly Nazi state. And the mentality on the street, and even in the schools and so on, as far as I understand, is clearly that. It is a Nazi-like mentality. Fascist is a given these days. Fascism is a given. It's like the whole. There are different examples, and you can see this in Israeli media. You see the way that Israeli commentators are speaking about Palestinians and so on. That Israeli lawmakers are speaking. They are even legislating laws these days against people like myself, Israeli citizens, who may assist the International Tribunal in The Hague. So right now there's a law being legislated saying that anyone who may assist the ICC, even just by publishing some information that may assist them, could land in prison for 5 years to life. Any Israeli citizen who may assist the International Tribunal. So a state that legislates that following international law would put you in prison for 5 years to life tells you everything that you need to know about that state. This is where we're at. I think that we are, at the last days of Zionism. It could take a while, but I do think that Zionism is in its last days, but it also means that it is doing really crazy stuff in order to try to survive these days. And I think that for Israelis, it is kind of the same type of mentality, the same type of thinking, whether they actually realize it or not, because a lot of it is, it's a psychological phenomena that we are dealing with when we talk about Zionism. So I don't know if people are aware of where their state is going. I mean, cognizant of it, but I'm sure that they sense something still. And there is this kind of, everyone is, I believe, that are in some sort of a survival mode. And that means that everything is amplified, basically. And you see that also on the street, and this is what I hear from my friends who are still living there. It is a very difficult situation to be in if you are not Zionist. Yes, at the same time, there are also those people who are still resisting from within, and this is really inspiring to see. And they should be given all the support. And there are both Palestinians and the few conscientious Israelis who are doing whatever they can to speak up and to resist from within. But it is getting more and more difficult to do so. The power is actually with all the rest of us who can apply pressure as much as we can. And we have to remember that when we take action against Elbit systems, for example, Israel cannot carry on bombing in Gaza without the constant, both constant political support that it gets, but also the constant shipment of weapons that it gets, mostly from the US and Germany. And we can basically disrupt the supply chain along the way, in different places along the way. And it's not that difficult to do so. So even though we are acting against very, very large forces, I mean, great forces with a lot of political power, with a lot of money and so on, it doesn't mean that we don't have the power to change things. In the UK alone, Elbit used to have 10 sites operating across the UK. Over the past 4 years, and the ongoing direct actions every week, every other week, yet another action, one after the other, 3 of these 10 sites have been permanently shut down. This is really impressive, considering that we are acting against some of the greatest forces. They are legislating laws against us. The Israeli embassy is communicating, colluding with the CPS, with the Crown Prosecution Service. So the Israeli embassy is colluding with the prosecution against us. We know that for a fact, which is highly illegal, by the way. All of these things are happening, and still we're able to have these achievements. And it's not only happening in the UK. So we have to remember that we do have power, and we are operating across the world. So I think that we shouldn't despair. Actually, the more that Israel is acting the way that it does, the more that it is both urgent for us to stop the crime, and also the more legitimacy and credibility that we have when we take action against these crimes.
Absolutely. I can't thank you enough, Ronnie, for that. Lauren here is excited about the anti-Zionist Congress. She's asking about accommodation. Can you share accommodation when you get there with different groups?
We will publish everything on the website, offer, do as much as we can to help everyone find accommodation and make it accessible as much as possible to everyone.
That's fair. And please do share any information, any updates on that, and links to that, and I'll share with everyone who's listening and who's missed out on joining us today. Ronnie, thank you extremely, very, very so much for this insightful and precious conversation. I'm really grateful, and everyone is.
Thank you so much for having me. Apologies for the technical difficulties. There were also things that we didn't get to cover, but maybe next time. But thank you for the patience, everyone.
Definitely, we'll have to interview you again next time. Maybe just go to Austria, just leave Germany for a bit, and the internet will get better. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today. The video recording will be sent out in the next couple of days. And I want to emphasize that this webinar was made free for people to register and attend. However, some people donated generously. So I want to thank everyone who donated, and all the money, rest assured that it's going to a family in Gaza that I'm in touch with. Again, thank you very much, and have a good morning, Ronnie, and good night, everyone.